And now that I'm hooked up with one of these fancy microphones as well, I'm ready to introduce our first speaker, which is going to be Victoria Joris. But before I introduce her, let me quickly re-explain the format of how these talks are going to work. So we will have 6 talks, each of them expected to be 30 minutes long, leaving 15 minutes of time for questions. Then after 2 talks, first 2 bachelor talks will be followed by a break. Then the 2 master talks again, they will also be followed by a break, and then ending with the 2 PhD talks, which will be followed by our networking apéro. Okay, so let me introduce our first speaker. So Victoria Joris is a bachelor student in medicine at the University of Geneva. She is also a member of ARP, and she's going to present, so the Student Association in Geneva, and she's going to present the effects of DMT on brain activity in a naturalistic setting. So specifically at Boom Festival, and that's research that was conducted alongside Dr. Christopher Timmermann and his research team from Imperial College London. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Victoria Joris.
Hello? Yes. Okay, it works. Do I just press, this is forward, this is back. Does it have a pointer? Oh. But there's another one next to it if you need the pointer. Okay, I'll get. All right, so I will be presenting today on a pilot study that we did at Boom Festival with Christopher Timmermann, who's the head of the DMT group at Imperial College London. And this is a pilot study, so there are many limitations to it. And the data that I'll be showing today is, I saw it a week and a half ago, so there aren't very clear conclusions yet, but I'm just going to be showing what we have and how it compares to existing data. So first I want to start with contextualizing why we want to study consciousness in general, altered states in consciousness, but all types. So first of all, well, what is it? How does it arise? So if I were to ask everyone in this room what consciousness is, I think you would all give me very different reports, maybe some similar, maybe not. And you would probably all validate different aspects of consciousness as being primary to our consciousness. And so despite this diversity of definitions, we share this sense, this really deep sense of being conscious beings, and of that being primary to our human experience. And there are so many different, theories of consciousness that point to different neural correlates of consciousness as being the neural correlates that are sufficient and necessary for consciousness. And so, since they're all different, as we can see, there's not really a clear consensus. And so consciousness is, we don't know what it is, we don't know how it arises, and yet it's the core of our human experience. So I think that says enough to say that it's already interesting to study. And as we study altered states, we see all these different aspects of experience that we find, primary to our conscious experience kind of fall away, like sense of self, or agency, or awareness of awareness. And so it's really interesting to study altered states as well. And then also more clinically, so psychiatry. Our treatments now are not any significantly better than they were 50 years ago. And 1 out of 8 people suffer from mental illness. And so this just goes to show that the way that we're conducting this research is stagnating, and we're not putting enough accent on the actual subjective experience of people. And if we don't show this genuine curiosity with no judgment for someone's experience, and that we don't really try and understand where someone is, I don't know how we can really help people. And again, consciousness is subjective. I equate it to subjective experience, so all different types of subjective experience fall under this. Disorders of consciousness. So 38% of people who are in minimally conscious states are actually misdiagnosed at first with being in a vegetative state. And the importance of that is that these 2 states have very different outcomes, very different treatments. And if we don't catch these, if we don't diagnose correctly very early on, we're missing really critical time. And so the outcome for the patient is going to be really different. And so we don't understand these disorders of consciousness, and so we need to study them to be able to give the better treatment outcome. anesthesia, I mean, we use it every single day, right? And we don't even know how it induces a loss of consciousness. It's crazy. And we also, I mean, a lot of people end up being conscious under anesthesia, and that's a very traumatic experience for many people. And so if we don't understand how this works, we won't be able to progress. And then also, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. The reason why I'm interested in the brain is because it explains, I mean, it might one day explain this experience, and this experience is what allows me to be curious about this experience, which is, I mean, super cool, and it's what allows us to make meaning, to love, to feel pain. And so I think these are all pretty great reasons to study consciousness. And so these are the methods, so here are a couple different methods to study consciousness. So we study neuroscience through a third-person point of view, but what we study is usually primarily lived experiences, so there is kind of a discrepancy in that. So we've got the more neuro-physiological, neuroanatomy approach, which is going to be fMRI, DTI, MEG, etc. And then we're going to have approaches that are more involved in subjective experience, like phenomenology and micro-phenomenology, which are techniques that are trying to get at the core of experiences without all the cognitive bias that we use to express these experiences that we're having. And then there's neurophenomenology, which I'm going to talk about all of these a little bit later, but it's trying to link both of them so that we bridge the gap between the subjective experience and what we're seeing on brain activity, so that we don't stop at the fact that these two things are separate. And so again, we need to look at altered states of consciousness. Why? Because our normal waking consciousness is just really one tiny part of consciousness, and it's like trying to study colors and just studying red, right? Like, you're not going to learn anything about colors. And so by finding everything that is gained or lost when we transition from different states, we get to different core aspects of subjective experience. Okay, so the next few slides are just to contextualize the importance of naturalistic settings, so doing it not just in a laboratory setting, and then of focusing on phenomenology. So what is phenomenology? So it's the study of subjective experience, and it was created by Edmund Husserl, who said that we need to go back to the things themselves. And what does he mean by that? He means the things that are actually given in a certain experience. And he brings up two things to use while we're trying to study the core of the subjective experience, which is eidetic reduction and a word I cannot pronounce, I think epoche, which, for example, in an experience of grief, there's so many different ways that we interpret our experiences, different intellectual ways of interpreting it, and so what we need to do is kind of tease all these things apart without judgment to get to the core of the experience. And Merleau-Ponty, who is also a phenomenologist, he said, "We live as embodied subjects who experience the world and its essential structures through our lived or phenomenal bodies." And so as we live as embodied beings, the way that we move through space and experience the space is primary to experience. And similarly, our experience is going to be very influenced by the space that we inhabit. So that includes the geographical, cultural factors, relational factors. And so again, for the same metaphor as the colors, if we don't study experience in different contexts, we're again missing fundamental aspects of subjective experience. And so just quickly, neurophenomenology, this was created by Francesco Varela, where he really tried to bridge these two aspects, because this Cartesian viewpoint that has been ruling science of we need to adopt a view from nowhere kind of leads to a existential predicament, as Sebastian Joris would say, in which everything that's scientific is objective and true, and it's external to us, and we don't have access to it. And everything that's lived and interior to us, there's no truth in it. And so we've got this huge discrepancy. And so Francesco Varela says that we need to recontextualize it and see interiority and exteriority as two sides of the same coin, as interdependent to each other. And so no content should be divorced from the context in which it has been produced. We have to build upon a style of thinking where the description reveals the properties of the observer rather than obscuring them. And the epistemology of participation sees man in continuity with the natural world. And so, again, it's quite easy to see how scientific accounts illuminate subjective experience, but the reciprocal from experience to science is typically ignored. And so, oops, well, that was a bit quick. And so this is what this study is trying to do, and many studies in consciousness science are now trying to do, is bridging these two things. So before we get to other aspects, I just want to introduce EEG, because I know that before looking at this data, I was really not familiar with EEG. And so what is it doing? So it's capturing really fast neural dynamics, and it's capturing the generation of very small electrical fields around the synaptic currents of layer 5 pyramidal neurons, which are in, so layer 5 of the cortex. It doesn't go deeper, which is a limitation of EEG. And it only picks up thousands of neurons firing. It cannot pick up one neuron firing. And so pretty much what we get is recordings of all these different waves, such as gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. And they're associated with different tasks. I mean, this is very simplified, obviously, but gamma with problem solving or concentration, it's the highest frequency. Alpha, for example, is reflective and restful states, so when you would imagine seeing more of the DMN activation. And then theta is with drowsiness, and delta with sleep and dreaming. And then just how to visualize this, so you see the little triangle in the front is where there's the nose, and then there's the ears, so you're just really, the mapping that we're using is just visualizing the brain from as if you're looking on top of someone's head. And the electrodes pick up the data, but in between the electrodes, there isn't actually any data, so we're just assuming that there's an incremental change between the electrodes. So there isn't actually any data between the electrodes, which is also a limitation. All right, so previous research. So I'm going to explain a bit what this could mean in a second, but in psychedelics, we see an overall alpha suppression, and we see an increase in theta and delta waves, and these changes are associated with the intensity of the experience. We also see an increase in theta power, which post-psilocybin, and this increase is correlated to a decrease in depressive symptoms. And so in depression, and obviously these studies, there's a lot of nuance. There are different studies saying different things, so more research has to be done, but we're seeing a trend of increase in alpha waves and decrease in theta waves, which is the opposite of what we see in psychedelics. And what could this mean? So I'm going to use the predictive coding framework, which is just a framework. We need more studies for this, but I think it explains this very well. So the predictive coding framework explains how certain sensory information can come into our consciousness, right? So when we have sensory information coming in, we also have a prediction of what we should be experiencing or seeing or sensing. And the discrepancy between those two signals leads to a prediction error. And depending on how much precision we have on our prediction, so depending on how many times you've been correct about this, you're going to have a higher precision on that prediction. And so it'll be harder to update your experience, right? So you're going to have sensory information coming in, and if there's a discrepancy, well, I know I'm right, so I'm going to disregard that, is kind of what's going on. And so these prediction errors can allow us to update our systems. And in depression, what we see is we see an overweighting of these predictions. And so it's a lot harder to have an update of our system when we have sensory information coming in. And in psychedelics, we see, and again, generalizations, but we see a decrease in that precision weighting. And so it's easier for sensory information, in a way, to change, to help us update our prior beliefs. And so high alpha and low theta has been associated with a lot more top-down control and precision, so a lot more influence and suppression on what kind of sensory information can flow into our consciousness. And in psychedelics, again, we see the opposite, and it's also linked to entropy, because higher entropy is usually correlated to more uncertainty about a certain state, so more uncertainty as well about your predictions. And then quickly, why should we look at entropy and complexity? Well, as I said before, we have a bunch of different theories which look at different neural correlates of consciousness and say that they're sufficient and necessary, but we don't really have a consensus. And recent research has been showing that so complexity, previous research now is looking at consciousness as this emergent property of collective dynamics, and complexity and entropy being certain measures of the richness of that state. And these measures, I mean, there are different ways of going about studying complexity and entropy, but most recent research has been really good at deciphering between different types of disorders of consciousness, between anesthesia, between psychedelic states, by just zooming out a little bit and looking at these dynamics and the, let's say, chaos or complexity within the system. And there are different ways, and I'm talking about these now because it'll be in the results, but the traditional way of looking at this is the Lempel-Ziv complexity, which is going to look at the diversity of patterns in a time series. So in EEG, we can assign the frequencies to different like ones and zeros, and we're going to have patterns of these, and the more diverse the patterns are, the more entropy you have. And this correlates with the intensity of psychedelic experience. But there are limitations, because with Lempel-Ziv, you have to cut up your data, and by cutting it up, you actually introduce more noise, and you might be missing information. And you also cannot decompose the frequency into its components. So you'll just see a big signal. You can't decompose it into like specific gamma or delta, or et cetera. And so complexity of a state space entropy is this really new method which permits us to look at Lempel-Ziv while overcoming all of these little issues, such as like the noise introduction and no decomposition. So it allows us to look at exactly what waves are contributing to this complexity and increase in entropy. All right, so to the actual study. So we actually scanned the brains of people on many different types of psychedelics. So there was LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, but for the sake of this analysis, we just looked at DMT. And the reason is that since it's very fast acting, you can take a before and after scan. And when people were on LSD, we had to ask them to come back for a scan, maybe a few days later. And in between, at this festival, people consume lots of substances. So it was adding more noise to the data. So we focused on DMT. And also because it has very pronounced visual aspects and a very interesting altered state of consciousness. And then people reported taking, well, they had to say what doses they were going to take. So if it was going to be low, medium, or high dose, which is the same thing that they did in clinical settings, but they injected the patients with low, medium, and high doses. And that's a lot more controlled, because at Boom, it was a subjective report of what dose people thought they were taking, which, again, depending on your level of expertise, you might rate that differently. Also, the substance was inhaled, which means that some people who didn't have experience with this didn't inhale correctly, which, again, adds limitations. But that's what we did. We also had surveys, so the mystical experience questionnaire, the 11D altered states of consciousness, ego dissolution, and for some participants, we conducted a neurophenomenology interview, which really tries to get at the implicit aspects of experience. And then, all right, so for the procedure, we had a 64-lead EEG, baseline recording of 23 participants, and then while you were doing that baseline recording, they were filling out certain preliminary questions like substance, etc. And then they inhaled the DMT, or the Changa, which I forgot to mention is DMT plus monoamine inhibitors. So it just lasts a bit longer. And then they inhaled it, and we recorded the EEG for 15 to 20 minutes, which was usually the average amount of time that that the experience lasted. And then they filled out the post-experience survey, and then we did the interviews. So some pictures. We had these shirts that I made that said, "Can we scan your brain on DMT?" with a QR code, and people would come up and just scan, and then could participate. And we also had flyers. That's the big poster, but we had flyers like that we hung up. And Cyril in the audience also helped with that. Thank you. And then, so we set up this very unprofessional camp under a tree, which was it had shade, which was very scarce there. And it was facing the sunset. So a lot of people, when they had their experiences, it was during sunset, and it was really beautiful. So, yeah. Oh, and that's the equipment, which we had lots of issues with it because of the sun. It would just keep crashing. But there we go. All right, so here's the preliminary data that we've been seeing. So on the top is the naturalistic, so the DMT data from Boom, and at the bottom is what Chris Timmermann has already seen in clinical settings. The theta here, just quickly before I talk about this, we see a decrease in it in the first minutes, but then throughout the experience, there is an increase in theta waves that are correlated with the intensity of the experience. So again, between the two of these, we see the signature increase in delta and theta waves. We see a massive suppression in the alpha waves, which coincides with the laboratory setting. And with the fact that maybe there is a relaxation of these prior beliefs. And this also corresponds with the suppression in alpha also corresponds with the intensity of the visual experience specifically, which is interesting because the visual cortex is more of a lower level system, so that would be the sensory information coming up is being less restricted. And so then maybe that could account for the reason why we're seeing such complex imagery with DMT. But what's really new, which has never been found with psychedelics before, is an increase of theta waves in the visual cortex, specifically in that region. And I don't know what this means. I know that this specific pattern has been observed in specifically phasic REM sleep, which there's two types of REM, there's tonic and phasic, and phasic REM sleep is associated with being particularly unaware with your surroundings, which I find interesting because usually when we talk about psychedelics, we think like, okay, immersion into your environment. But maybe this coincides with being immersed into like this new world that people report having been into, this new, like this breakthrough. Why are we only seeing this in the boom data? I don't know. Does this have to do with the naturalistic setting? I'm not sure. Does it have to do with the fact that our data is noisy? Maybe. But I think it's really interesting that this is popping up now. And then, yeah, we don't see an increase in gamma waves in the naturalistic setting. Again, does this have to do with the setting or other factors? I'm not sure, but it's really worth exploring. And then this is the part that excites me the most about this study. So there's in the lab settings, we were able to do a Lempel-Ziv complexity analysis, and we saw an increase in entropy under DMT, which also coincided obviously with the intensity of the experience. And this didn't come out significant for the boom data. So Marek, who was one of the people on the team, he decided to use this new measure that reduces the amount of noise and allows us to have a more specific decomposition of what signals are actually contributing to entropy. And he found that the increase in the diversity of the pattern of gamma is driving a lot of the complexity, but so is delta waves. And this is what's really interesting because the one study that used this method looked at LSD, and they actually saw an increase in gamma, but they saw a decrease in the complexity of delta waves. And so, I mean, I don't know if this is valid, but my first thought is, what if the fact that delta waves are increased in complexity is what is accounting for the difference in subjective experience between LSD and DMT, because they're both classic psychedelics, you know, they bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, they both have certain similar aspects to the experience, but they have very fundamental differences in their subjective experiences. And so could the fact that the increase in complexity in the delta signal be kind of driving this? I don't know, but I think this is something that would be really interesting to look into. And then for the subjective experience questionnaires, so we pretty much saw a reduction in the intensity of everything at boom. Is this because of the naturalistic setting? Is this because of the fact that we had many limitations to the study? I'm not sure. But what's really interesting is that we do still see an increase in meaning, and we see an increase in blissful state, and we see a marked decrease in anxiety. Again, there are limitations. I'll talk about this later, but I do find it interesting that meaning was increased, even though every other aspect almost was decreased. One that I find very odd, however, is that there's a decrease in audio-visual synesthesia, because it was boom festivals, so most of the time when we were collecting this data, there was 5 minutes. There was a large amount of psytrance booming in people's ears, and we saw reduced audio-visual synesthesia. Interesting. For the MEQ, we saw a decrease in everything, again, except for positive mood, which is interesting. Again, I'm not sure what this means, but it's interesting that the intensity ratings were a bit lower at boom. I would have suspected the opposite. But yeah. So here are some quotes from the participants when we asked about what entity they had encountered. So The first one says, the entity took me to a new level of reality where it showed me the fabric of existence. There was another entity that was described as telepathic, clear, peaceful, and not talking. It was leading her and making it clear to trust herself in her path and her life projects. And another one described the entity as truth, mother energy, the source. And so yeah, so these are some quotes from the people after their experiences. So conclusions. There are many limitations, which just goes to show that it's really important to keep doing this kind of research. This was the first at a festival, and I think it's really important to do this again because our experiences are so influenced by the space in which we are. And so if we really want to study consciousness, we need to study it in many different contexts. So yeah, the limitations are control for the dose and the substance, movement, a lot of people were moving around. The EEG headset, we had to wet people's heads to put it on, but some people had dreads, so it was complicated. And it was really hot, so things were things were evaporating quickly, and so the signal was lost sometimes. And the equipment kept dying, which, not during, but it just limited the sample size, let's say. And then, yeah, so the psychiatric implications for meaning making. I mean, as we know, meaning making, a reduction in meaning making is also associated with more depression and anxiety. And so this meaning making is very primary to mental health and, well, to experiences as humans. And so if we're seeing an increase in meaning, what could this mean about the setting of psychedelic therapy? Should we extend it to maybe people have the opportunity to have their session in nature, or to have it in a more personalized setting, or at home? What can we do about making setting more comfortable for people? And I think that's going to be really important in the outcome of the psychedelic therapy. The theta waves in the occipital cortex, very new finding, never seen that in psychedelics, really interesting. I don't know what it means because we haven't even talked about this as a group yet, but is it specific to the setting? I think that's interesting to look at. Are these changes that we're seeing really specific to the fact that it was a boom, or were there other confounding factors? And then I think we need to apply this complexity, space, state, entropy measure to lots of other data. So different types of psychedelics, unconscious states, depression, like a wide variety of experiences, and see if the differences in which waves are actually driving this change in subjective, this change in complexity. Are these changes associated to the different subjective experiences? And is there a correlation there or not? And then, yeah, continue this research, keep doing it, because it's so important. And now that we figured out that heat is a huge problem in this, I don't know how we can account for that, but we can try and account for it and make things easier for ourselves. And yeah, so this is thanks to Christopher Timmermann, who, as I said, is the lead of the DMT research group. Cyril, who's in the audience, thank you. And then there was Marek, Jennifer, Constanza, David, and James Sanders. Thank you. Oh, questions?
Thank you, Victoria, for the wonderful talk. Really valuable and important research. I'm sure a lot of people, the research field can still benefit a lot from more of this research being done. And also, there's probably still a lot of challenges that we need to learn to overcome, as we heard in the limitations. So now we're going to have the time for questions, and the microphones are passing around. So just put up your hand if you would like to ask a question.
Very interesting talk. I have a question to the quotes, as the entity was described as female and mother-like. Is there a hypothesis?
Wait, sorry, can you start over? I didn't hear that.
Very interesting talk. I have a question to the quotes regarding the entity that was seen being described as mother-like and female. Do you have a hypothesis if this is intrinsic to the substance or based on societal gender roles?
So I'm not sure, but the reports were very different. Someone was in an alien land that was very terrifying, in which the entity had nothing to do with motherly energy. The woman, the person who reported on this was also a woman who had, her experience was very around this sort of energy. So maybe it has to do more with our priors, with our intentions. But I'm not sure, because it did come back a couple times. So maybe it's also what we associate with pure love. I'm not sure, depending on the person, and maybe that's having a correlation, but I don't know. And the entities all had different forms. Some of them weren't even like describable, just I know there's a presence, and I don't know what it means. So, no, good question, I'm not sure.
Hey, I really like the setup. That was great of the study. But I wanted to ask, so is there a difference between people taking the DMT in the clinical setting in comparison to a naturalistic setting when we talk about the experience? Because I can imagine the people that were just trying DMT, like one of the strongest psychedelics known to man, had some experience before. So I would like to know if this has any like the impact, the previous experience, or if there is no studies on that.
So I actually forgot to mention something really important that I wanted to talk about, which was intention. I don't have an answer for this. I'm sure that it does have an impact, but this aspect of intention I think is really important. People who sign up for a study in a clinical setting, they have to dedicate half a day of their half a day to this, or even more. They have to have blood samples taken. So I would expect maybe there to be more intentionality in the experience, more preparation around it, rather than at boom, somewhere where people just take the substance anyways. And so maybe that has also an impact in the intensity. I'm not sure, but I think that's interesting to look at. And I think there are some studies that have looked at intention and prior experience, but I'm not confident on that. But I definitely do think it will alter the experience. We did have participants who tried for the first time at Boom with us. And well, that was actually the quote about, oops. Oh, there it is. That was the female goddess one, as well as the telepathic, clear, and peaceful one. That was that person's first time trying DMT. So, no, I think it's really important to look at these specific markers of, like, have you done it before? What's your intention? Things like that.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah.
So people were at the festival, right? Did you ask about the previous consumption?
Yeah.
Could the differences be caused by that, or you just picked out the sober people?
No, so we asked if they had any other substances in their system, and if they had taken substances throughout the week, and if they had prior experience with psychedelics. Most of them had prior experience with psychedelics, just not necessarily with DMT. And that's one of the future things we need to do, is try and see the influence of this on the outcome. So can we control for dosage? Can we control for previous experience and see the outcome, see if that changes the results?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's a bit similar to the question she just asked, but like my understanding was that the sample of people you selected for the study was not exactly random, as in they were mostly people coming from a festival, meaning a lot of them had a previous psychedelic experience. So the question was, to what extent do you think this affected the results?
Well, I mean, definitely, but just like in a clinical setting, we have the results I'm comparing to are healthy volunteers, which means it's people who also wanted to take the substance. So that's already a bias. It's a bias in both. And then, yeah, also people who want to go get their brains scanned for science maybe have a particular view of the DMT experience, or of, psychedelics in general, which definitely, I think, does impact the results. And then the thing that's difficult is that to have ethical approval, we can't just go up to people and be like, here, take DMT and let's sample this, randomly. It had to be people who were planning on taking it, and we couldn't help them figure out how to take it because we didn't have authorization for that. So you just had to sit there and watch, for people who wanted, they could come. But yes, that definitely influences it. I mean, all of our, priors and cognitive biases affect it.
So you just picked them up at the festival and made them sign a contract or something like that?
Yeah, they just, they would scan the thing and then come to our tent, or they would see us and talk to us, and Yeah.
Nice.
Thanks. I have a question concerning the eyes. Did you control if participants had eyes open or closed during the vision? Because you can have both, and I think it will change a lot the brain activation, especially in the visual zone.
Yeah, exactly. No, so we advised eyes closed, but people, I mean, it's the same thing in all studies with psychedelics. We advise not to move and to close your eyes, but you don't know what they're going to do during their experience, right? So some people move, some people open their eyes, but we did advise it to close your eyes.
Okay.
And we didn't control for this. Again, there are many limitations to this because it's also the first one done in this way.
Okay, thanks. That's very cool research.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. And I see here we have basically an example of how to do research in a very different setting of the, compared to normal research. So we are doing research in a festival. In a festival like that, there are many things happening, I guess, huh? And many substances are taken. So I was wondering if you could imagine other ways, very creative ways, to test other research hypotheses in such a setting.
You mean how to control for certain of these things?
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I think very creative way to do this. Let's see. Well, I think we need, first of all, more rigorous questions and a bigger data set so that we can actually control for these things. More rigorous questions as in, with the prior drug experience, how long have you been sober for in the past 24 hours? I think it would be interesting to take blood tests. I don't know if this is something we can do, but there are hospitals on site, so I'm sure we could have specific, people who are in the healthcare domain do this. To just kind of get a more control for that dose, and then also make sure that we have a report on when the music was playing, at what time, to see if when music was playing in the background, there's a difference with when there was no music. Yeah, so I think we need a much larger data set to do that, and then we just need more rigorous questions, and maybe some blood tests would be interesting. I don't know.
There's also a lake there in that festival?
Yeah.
Maybe people take drugs and go to the lake? I don't know.
I think one person did want to go by the beach and did do that.
Thanks a lot. Regarding the eyes closed and the theta waves, are you aware of any studies with people taking psychedelics that have some visual impairments, like blindness?
Oh, I want to do that. No, I have been thinking about that. I don't know the studies. Maybe there have been, if anyone knows in the audience. But that would be really interesting.
Do you think it would still be in the occipital lobe, or it would?
So I don't know. I think so. We see with people who are congenitally blind, I think there's some plasticity in the brain, so certain cortices were maybe going to try and compensate for it, so maybe there would be a difference, or maybe we'd see more, I don't know, maybe more activation in the auditory cortex. I have no idea, but I would think that if there has been compensation in that way, plasticity, maybe we'd see what cortex has compensated for the visual side maybe pop up more, or maybe we would see visual activation. Maybe there's a difference between congenitally blind and people who have acquired blindness. But I think that's a superb question to ask.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was really nice. As for the difference between natural setting and the laboratory setting, if we see, the traditional way to take DMT and why people started taking DMT, that was basically around nature, around like the plants that had DMT. Do you think that other types of life that are around also have their electric fields, and could they interact with the fields that we have in our brain, like beta, delta, and the fields you tell, and that's part of the therapeutical way of taking it, like in a traditional way, like indigenous peoples used to describe it at first, like spirits and all these subjective experiences. Do you think that maybe has a role, or how could we develop a model to study these things? Like not like, I'm not saying spirits, but like the electric fields generated by other types of life, plants, animals that are around these.
So I don't know enough about EEG and electrical fields to have an answer on that, but I definitely do agree that all these things are going to fundamentally affect our experience, since it is in the space that we inhabit. I think it would be really interesting to see, like, are there like frequencies around maybe that are interacting in a certain way with our brain? I don't know enough about this to have an answer, but I think it's a fascinating question, and I think with science we have to keep asking questions that aren't typically asked, and this is one of them, and I think that could be a really interesting thing to explore. I definitely do think there is an effect. I just don't know where it's coming from, if it's from, as you're saying, like electrical waves, or if it's just the way that we make sense of our surroundings and what these things mean to us.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Victoria.